Okay, so far in the backswing, I've talked about how you rotate the left arm flying wedge to your end backswing position on the plane while keeping the flying wedge intact. And I've explained how you can use the right arm in the right forearm takeaway to help you stay on plane and support the flying wedge at the end backswing. So at the end backswing, you have the straight left arm and the right forearm supporting it, and those two together, the intact flying wedge on plane supported by the right forearm flying wedge, which is attached to the body through the right humerus, represents what we call the power package. So I've explained all the details about how to get your power package assembled. But as I mentioned previously, while you're doing that, you're rotating your pelvis and you're rotating your upper torso to a greater degree than the pelvis. And what I'm going to describe now in detail is how you load your pelvis in the backswing and also how you load your upper torso. And these are all occurring simultaneously. In other words, as you start from the address position to the takeaway and then beyond, notice that the pelvis rotates and the upper body in a synchronized way. So let's go ahead. You could use a driver, and I'm going to point out certain features. Now, if I disappear from the screen, it's just to get equipment that's on the side there. So you just go to your end backswing position. Now, if you look here at Jim at his end backswing position, he's turned his pelvis by a finite amount, and you'll notice that he still has flex in his knee here. His right knee is flexed more, and it's adducted towards the center, so his knee is moved inwards a little bit, but notice that he still has his left heel grounded. So the questions that come up is, how do you perform the pelvic motion? And the key concept is the pelvic motion is essentially the feeling of rotating, and there is no sense of swaying side by side. So people, when they think of rotating, it's the feeling of rotating in a barrel. So I've taken a piece of hosepipe, which I'm going to represent an imaginary opening of a barrel. So if this was over here and a golfer was centralized before turn, the concept is the pivot motion. Both the pelvis and the upper torso are rotating within this barrel. So let's just put this over here around your body, and you could actually do this. You could do it with a golf club. And I'm going to hold this. Notice that at rest, his pelvis is roughly centered between his feet. Now, and as he turns to the end backswing position, notice how his pelvis looks like it remains roughly in the center. And that's one option you have, is to stay centralized. Do it again. So you'll notice that there's no sway motion of the pelvis. And so how do you do that? How do you stay centered? So what I'm going to get over here is essentially, just takes a go there. And if you put this on the outer border of the foot, and this could be done if you practice at a golf range where you could buy a stick that you could actually jam into the ground if you didn't have someone to hold it. And you'll notice that at rest there is this gap here between the two. Between this pole, which represents a vertical pole outside the outer border of the foot, and the pelvis. And in slow motion, he's going to go to his end backswing, and notice that this distance actually increases because the right hip joint and the head of the femur, the right femoral head, is moving backwards and towards the target. So it feels like the buttocks moves back and towards the target. Now, what you don't want to do is sway. So I want Jim to demonstrate swaying. Now, notice that he's swaying it. He's hitting against the pole. And then the outer border of your pelvis, if you do it too much, will actually get outside. See, like that, it's way outside the foot. And so the feeling is you turn into your hip joint, like this. You turn into it. You don't sway over it. And at your end backswing position, you don't feel like you're sitting over your foot. You feel like you've kept certain flex in the knee. And the other thing you do to prevent the swaying is you push it down into the ground. So at address, if you were standing on these force pressure plates, which enable in the research laboratories to measure how much pressure you're exerting down into the ground at each foot, at the beginning, at address, you might be 50-50. And then, I'll let you hold that. Thank you. And as you start, some people like to just give an extra bit of pressure in the left foot, just like before they start the turn. So it might go from 50-50 to 55-45. But then immediately you feel like you're pressing down into the ground, so that by your end backswing position, you have 80% of your pressure, weight pressure, under the right foot and only 20% under the left foot. And that will apply whether the left heel remains down or whether the left heel turns. It wouldn't be any different. You're pressing down into the ground. And this center of pressure reading that they measure has nothing to do with your static weight. In other words, your static weight would be just measured with a machine that just measures your weight and represents your mass. And during the swing, notice that if you turn in centrally, like you turn in a barrel and staying in the center of the barrel, there's very little change in my mass. I'm still in the center. Now, of course, you take your arm to the right, so that's a little bit of extra weight on that side due to the fact that both arms are there. But your head is more or less in the center, and you are staying in the center. So there's very little change in the center of mass motion in the backswing. But there's a significant increase in the center of pressure. And by pressing down into the ground and weight loading it, it helps to prevent any sway motion to the right, and you can keep the flex in the knee. Now, I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate that there's various degrees of pelvic rotation. So let's just look at that aspect. I'm going to thread this through his belt buckle, and this will give us a measurement. You'll notice that this is parallel to the ball target line at address. Now, when he goes to his normal end backswing position, you can see that his pelvis is rotated, I would say about 50 degrees from address. The other thing you'll notice is that the pelvis is tilted so that this right hip joint is higher than the left. And that makes sense because as you turn, you're keeping this leg straight, and this leg becomes more bent because your pelvis is not weighted on this side. If 80% of your center of pressure is down into this foot and only 20% there, it would not be unusual for this to sink down a bit so that your left hip joint at the end backswing position is a little lower, as you can see here. This is lower there. But it is actually acceptable to turn. There are many professional golfers who keep it pretty centralized. Now, the other aspect is how the concept, should you keep, like Jim, you'll notice that he keeps his left heel totally grounded through the swing, and he keeps the flex in the knee. And I would say the majority of modern-day professional golfers look like that, with about 40 to 50 degrees of pelvic rotation, a little bit of elevation of the right hip joint, which is referred to by Robert Baker as the negative O factor. He just says, if you were just level, that would be no O factor. If this pelvis gets higher, that's a negative O factor. If this pelvis in the downswing gets higher, that he calls that a positive O factor. And we'll go into that when we discuss the downswing. So let's look again at Jim at his end backswing position. And you'll notice that he has an increased bend here in this knee, and 80% of the pressure is here and only 20%. But he could, do what they did in the old days, like Bobby Jones in the 1930s and in the 1940s, Sam Snead, had a much bigger degree of pelvic rotation, and they turned beyond 50 degrees, maybe 60, 70 degrees, and they let the left leg come up. You see, look how much pelvic rotation. This is at least 70 degrees now of pelvic rotation. He's still turning centrally in the barrel. Notice that this leg is straighter, so there's less flex in the knee. Notice that this knee has moved way towards the midline and he's elevated the left heel. And that's an acceptable way, alternative. In other words, you could do what Jim does in his normal swing, or you could have a much greater degree of pelvic rotation. Now, Brandel Chambly, in his book, The Anatomy of Greatness, very much favored a greater degree of pelvic rotation. And he said, and when he calls his book The Anatomy of Greatness, he thinks that modern day golf instruction has lost its way because the modern day professional golfers have a much more restricted hip turn. And he believes it's a disadvantage with the idea that a greater degree of pelvic rotation is better. But I'm going to demonstrate why I believe that he's wrong. Because I believe that Jim's degree of rotation, which is representative of the modern golf swing, and if you look at my website where I wrote a review paper on the modern golf, on pelvic rotation, I used examples of golfers like Jason Day and Jordan Spieth and Adam Scott as examples of golfers who have just about 40, 50 degrees rotation and who keep it down. And I'm going to explain, when we come to the pelvic rotation biomechanics, why that's perfectly adequate. Because it's not the range of motion that's critical, it's the feeling of loading your pelvis. And I'll have a lot more to say on that when I talk about what do we mean by loading the pelvis. So the critical point to understand is you have to turn into the hip joint so that the right hip joint goes into internal rotation. Now, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to go back to the hoop. Now, I mentioned that Jim stays pretty centralized, but it is perfectly acceptable to have a little bit of sway during your backswing. So I'm going to get him to, say if this was a barrel, and to get a little closer to this outer border of the barrel here, without the pelvis actually going outside the foot, because we don't want the pelvis to go outside. Okay? And you notice that he's closer to that edge, but he's still inside his foot. Notice that the pelvis has moved from a central position to being a little bit towards the outside, and I refer to that as right pelvic loading. And that's perfectly acceptable. There are many professional golfers who do that, and Gary Woodland is a very good example. And Ben Hogan, who thought that the greatest golf swing that he ever saw in his era was a lady, Mickey Wright, and he said, she's got the best golf swing that he has ever seen. That's a big compliment from Ben Hogan, and she used a right with right loading pelvis. Now, I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate left loading, so that as you're rotating the barrel, you push your pelvis. Let me get it centralized first. Okay, now it's in the center. Now, as he goes back, he's going to push towards the left side. Go even more. Yeah, like that. See, now he's closer to the left side of the barrel, but his outer board of his pelvis is still inside his foot. He hasn't gone. Now, this leg, notice it's more slanted. In other words, if you go to the left a bit, instead of being vertical, your knee is straighter, and this is slanted. And Ben Hogan looked like that in his end backswing position. And Arnold Palmer looked like that, and Jack Nicklaus looked like that. So that as you turn in the barrel, you feel like you're pushing your pelvis to the left side of the barrel opening. But you're still centralized. In other words, it's still a rotary motion, but it's perfectly acceptable to load to the left. Now, when I say load to the left, I'm talking about the position of the pelvis. But the amount of pressure in the right foot must still be 80% and not do what the stack and tilt golf instructors teach, where you have 80, 60 or 70% of your weight that you're in backswing into your left foot, so that is something that I believe is very undesirable. So, and you can't tell just by looking. So I could turn centrally and have my pelvis to the right, and I can feel it. I'm still pressure loading the right foot by 80%, and I could look the same, but I'm actually now I feel I'm pressure loading the left foot by about 60% and this one 40. And I will explain later why it's a disadvantage to weight pressure load the left side rather than the right side. So I've explained the concept of the three options you have: center pelvic loading, right loading, or left loading. Now let's talk about the upper body. Let's put this to the side. Go ahead. So let's look what's happening. Notice that at rest, I'm just going to get this little right here. And if you look at Jim at address, he has a little bit of rightwards tilt of his spine. And when he returns in his backswing, he's turning around his rightward spine. So if you look at the spine, it doesn't look like it changes much. But he has a distinct slant. So if I put this on his back there, you notice it's definitely slanted to the right. But he's staying pretty centralized. Notice, go do it again. Let's look at his head. And you'll notice that his head virtually doesn't move. But there's a distinct slant of his body. And I refer to that as a rightward centralized, if you would hold that. So you're here, notice I've got a bit of rightwards tilt, and you turn around your spine without swaying your head like that. Your head should never move outside your feet like that. Your head could move an inch or 2, 3, even 3 inches when you do that. Or it could stay in the center, but notice at the end back swing position, there's a distinct rightwards look to the spine. And that I refer to as a rightwards centralized, because it's still in the center, upper torso rotational movement. But it's also acceptable to have what I call a vertical centralized, which I'll let Jim do. So do your normal swing again, rightwards centralized. Now what he's going to do is, as he does the backswing, he's going to arch his back a little to the target. In other words, you're extending your thoracic spine towards the target, and I refer to that as an arch extension maneuver. So if he does that, then he'll look more centralized now. You know that if his spine seems to be centralized, and that's perfectly acceptable to have that look. And Sean O'Hare, when he was being coached by Sean Foley, had that look, vertical centralized. Now the stack and tilt golfers, and golfers taught by Sean Foley, have what's called a left centralized. So as they turn, they have so much arch extension that you can see that at the end backswing, they're a little bit to the left. Right, so his upper torso is a little tilted this way to the left. That's called leftward centralized. Now again, that's susceptible. There's these three variations. Rightward centralized, vertical centralized, and leftward centralized. However, I'll get you to hold that, thank you, is if you decide to use leftward centralized, you should still have 80% on your pressure under your right foot. I don't believe, like the stack and tilt golf teachers who say, you know, you have leftward centralized, this part of your body seems to bulge out again because you have that look to you, and then this leg has 60% of the weight. And I don't think that's a biomechanically efficient way to load yourself during the backswing. So I've discussed now how to assemble the pelvic package in the optimum way in the backswing, how to load your pelvis. So let's look at Jim's end backswing position as he finds it biomechanically comfortable to do. So if you look at him, he has a center pelvic loading. His left foot is still grounded. He has about 50 degrees of pelvic rotation. This pelvis, right hip joint's a little higher than the left. He's using a rightward centralized upper body motion. You'll notice he's got his power package perfectly assembled, where here is the left arm flying wedge intact with a geometrically flat left wrist. And you can prove it two ways. Put this rod across here and you can see they're in line. And if you look at the club face at the top over there, the club face is parallel to the back of the geometrically flat left wrist, parallel to the watch face on the lower forearm. So you have an intact flying wedge. You'll notice that the right forearm is supporting the left arm flying wedge on the plane, and the butt end is pointing at the ball target line, so he's on plane. Now, his club face, go do it again, get your own backswing. As I said, he has a slightly shortened swing that's pointing to the left. And who does he look like? He looks like Gary Woodland. Gary Woodland has also a position where he feels very loaded, very compact swing. The arms are close to the body and he doesn't get too parallel. And Gary Woodland is one of the longest drivers on the PGA Tour. Now, I like that position. I mean, it's thing, but it's not obligatory. You certainly can have a graded degree of turn. So do that again. So I mentioned he had 50 degrees of pelvic rotation. He probably has a little bit more than 90, maybe 100 degrees of upper torso rotation. And the difference between the two is referred to as your static X factor, which is an idea that Jim McLean came up with the idea. And he believed at one point, and I believe he's changed his views, that you should restrict your pelvic turn so that you could get a greater degree of upper torso turn, and that would load you better. But I don't believe that's true. In other words, I don't believe you should artificially restrict your pelvic turn to, say, 30 or 40 degrees. You can go to 40, 50 degrees comfortably, load your pelvis well, and then you could load it. Now, if this represents the thoracic turn, and Jim gets to 100 degrees, if you are flexible and you go to 130 or 140, that's fine, as long as you load it. You never want to get the feeling that you're losing your spine angle standing up just to get extra turn. You must always feel compact and turning yourself in terms of the degree of loading.
And Jeff, another thing people do, they'll bend this left arm so that they can feel more loaded. Kind of like this.
Yes.
So there's no magic of getting this parallel to the floor or the ground.
Go to your backswing position. Notice it's pointing left. Now, if he had a degree, say 20 or 30 degrees of extra upper torso turn, that would get to parallel. But you should never try to get to parallel by separating the arms away from the torso, just to get to parallel. There's no obligatory need. There are some professional golfers who even only go this far. Very short swings. And the good thing about having a shorter swing is, notice how the arms seem to be connected to the body. Now I'm going to demonstrate my swing, and you'll notice that I become disconnected. And here I am. So I go back, and that's about as far as I seem to be able to turn. But I'm not comfortable stopping there, so notice what I do. I start to bend my arms, and you notice that, look how far my club goes back, much further. Notice that my right elbow is flying. So I'm here, go back, and I should stop there because that's there. But what I often do is this. Notice how my club is crossing the line. Notice that my right elbow is now flying and that my right form is horizontal. Right? There's no advantage because this extra motion, actually, you are less connected. You want the body and the arms to go back together. So this, watch out, body and arms going back. The left arm flying wedge is rotating onto the plane, using the right form, take away. And that's where you should stop. In other words, if you can't turn more than that, that's a very good end backswing position to do. And because then once you start the downswing, notice with the pelvic rotation, upper body rotation, notice how the power package which is assembled is being pulled by the pivoting torso here. And if you disconnect like that, then your body moves independently and this is just flopping around in space. Right?
Very good.
Is there anything you think we need to discuss about the backswing that we haven't discussed?
I think we're good.
Okay, so we've done the backswing. Now we're going to go and move on to the downswing. And that's a very detailed, it's going to take a long time to discuss everything about the downswing because it's so much more complex than the backswing. And that will be the next section we'll discuss.